thank you for your pursuit of the truth. Because today, when we talk about Ukraine, that's really what we want to get at more than anything else, is what's the truth? Because the truth has been very difficult to discover, and very few Americans have heard the truth. And it's not just Americans, it's most of us in the West. So if you look at the situation today, we have to go back probably into the first part of this century at a series of discussions that Mr. Putin, when he became president, held with leaders in the West, trying to articulate to them his concerns about the expansion of the NATO alliance. And in 2008, despite these discussions, we made it clear that we didn't care, that we were going to advance the borders of NATO east to include Ukraine. And now keep in mind that Russia does already have a border with NATO. It's in Estonia. It's a small border just south of St. Petersburg. But the Russians view whatever happens in Ukraine as a potentially existential matter for them. And in 2014, we backed or staged or orchestrated a coup that put in power a very radical regime that was hostile to the interests of Moscow and to Russia. And as a result of this, Mr. Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin were convinced that the United States Navy would very shortly end up docking in Crimea, in Sevastopol, and take over the naval facilities there. And that's one of the reasons that Putin struck quickly and seized control of Crimea, because he wasn't prepared to cede dominance in the Black Sea to the United States and NATO. Subsequently, the Ukrainians began attacking citizens inside their borders who were Russians. And almost a third of the population certainly is first and foremost Russian speaking, and probably 20 to 25% are frankly Russians living in the part of Ukraine where today the fighting is occurring. And these people were treated as second-class citizens. They were told to become Ukrainians, to abandon their heritage, their language, their culture, or they would be subject to harsh treatment, which of course many of them were. At the same time, there were two oblasts or provinces in the east, Luhansk and Donetsk, that indicated they wanted to retain their Russian culture. They would stay inside Ukraine, but they wanted to continue to live as Russians inside Ukraine. This was unacceptable to the new regime, and the new regime began shelling them. And in the space between the outbreak of the current war on 22 February last year and 2014, when this crisis first began, 14,000 people were killed in that area. And the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe has reported very clearly that all of this was started not by Russia, but by the new Ukrainian government. Now, over time, it became very clear that some solution had to be found to avoid expanding this war. And that is one of the reasons why the Minsk Accords were drafted. And they were simply drafted with the goal in mind of providing equal rights before the law for the Russians in eastern Ukraine and putting an end to the violence and the killing. This, unfortunately, never occurred. And now we know from the statements from Chancellor Merkel in December of last year and more recently from President Macron that these agreements were in fact a fraud, that these agreements were designed to simply buy time for Ukraine while we poured billions of dollars and extraordinarily good modern equipment and training into the Ukrainian armed forces, specifically the army.
Can I interrupt you, Colonel McGregor?
Yes.
You can explain to the audience about who drafted the accord and who were signatories to it.
Well, it was France, Great Britain. I think it was Great Britain and Germany and Russia. And of course, we were not really signatories to it, but we were co-sponsors, if you will. We were backing it.
And the Ukrainian government refused to ratify it. It was voted on, I believe, by the citizens of Donbass.
Yes, I mean, this was everything that was contained in those accords was acceptable to Russia and acceptable to the citizens of Ukraine who were Russians. Unfortunately, there was never any intention to impose any of it.
I want to interrupt you one more time because I don't want to spoil your train of thought. I want you to
understand.
I think it's important to establish because the Minsk Accords show what Russia at that point was willing to settle for. So that's, if you look at this current military exercise, which has now killed 300,000 Ukrainians, it's almost unimaginable that at the end of this, they're going to get back that Ukraine is going to get back what it could have gotten with just a signature on that agreement with the Minsk Accords. Can you just tell, as my understanding is, that it was that NATO would not move into Ukraine, that I believe that the missile launchers that we have in the Ukraine would be removed, that the people, the ethnic Russians in the eastern Ukraine, that some of that would be an autonomous region within Ukraine. So it would continue to be part of Ukraine, but the people would have some rights.
Yes, you're talking about something that the Russians were willing to accept, which is effectively a multi-ethnic, multinational state, which is not a new development in Europe. We've had them over the centuries. Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Tsarist Russia were all multinational states. So there was no interest on Russia's side in breaking up Ukraine. Far from it. They were happy to have it intact. Now, this, of course, does not address Crimea. And at the time, they were unwilling to address Crimea because, from their standpoint, with considerable justification, the majority of people in Crimea are Russians and wanted to be part of Russia. But more important, it had been part of Russia since 1776. And it was an accident of history created by our friend Khrushchev in a drunken stupor that changed the hands of Crimea and put it in the camp of Ukraine. Bottom line is, there was no interest in the West, in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, in changing anything that would benefit Russia, certainly not changing what they had planned for Ukraine. And by the time you reached December of 21 and January of 22, it's very obvious to the Russians that this force that has grown up in eastern Ukraine is actually very formidable, well-trained, well-equipped, and was poised, frankly, to attack those two breakaway provinces with the goal, ultimately, of retaking Crimea. So from their vantage point, this was a preemptive strike to prevent that war from breaking out. And for those who say, well, this is evidence for Russia's desire to expand and rebuild the Soviet empire, we ought to keep something in mind. When the Russians went in, they went in with a remarkably small force. I mean, Ukraine's the size of Texas. They went in on the ground with 90,000 combat troops. The Ukrainians, of course, put up fierce resistance because they were already present and ready to fight. But most important, Moscow seemed to think that once this began, there was a willingness in the West to become serious and finally negotiate an arrangement. And it took several months for Mr. Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin to realize no one wants to talk. There will be no negotiations. And you'll recall that in April, Boris Johnson, the prime minister, flew to Kiev and essentially told Zelensky, don't negotiate with these people. We'll provide you with whatever you need. We'll stick with you until you win. And of course, in March, that's exactly what President Biden had said. So they wanted to stop any potential movement that would have resulted in some sort of compromise, particularly a compromise that would have made Ukraine neutral. And of course, neutrality was always very attractive. Austria was made neutral in 1955, and in large part because Eisenhower was anxious to make more states neutral in Europe, because he said we can't possibly protect them all. Well, here we are now insisting that nothing can be neutral. Everything must belong to NATO, and it has to happen on our terms. This is something Russia can't accept. And so the Russians decided, well, now we're at war. We're going to have to go over to the defense, build up our forces, and prepare to end this war on our terms. And that's essentially what you've watched since late September, October, Russia on the defense, while the Ukrainians launched countless counterattacks against them. And this has turned out to be a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. They've lost, as you point out, over 300,000 dead. The Russians, in contrast, contrary to what the mainstream media says, have had perhaps 30,000 killed and perhaps 40 or 50,000 more wounded. But the difference between the Ukrainian wounded and the Russian wounded is profound. The Russians rapidly evacuate people, and most of the wounded return to duty, whereas the wounded Ukrainians rarely get the medical attention they need in time, and they don't usually return to duty. So the losses are irreparable. And at this point, we have a very desperate regime in Kiev that will do anything to try and drag the United States, preferably, into war on its behalf. And that's why you see these ridiculous drone strikes against Moscow, in the hopes that someone will say, well, see, the Ukrainians have some life left in them. We just need to help them a little more. when in reality, they are definitely on the ropes. And they know that when the ground finally dries out, there are hundreds of thousands of Russian troops who will come out of their defensive positions and attack. And that will probably happen at the end of May or in early June. Well, remember that one of the chief reasons that President Putin finally decided to move into eastern Ukraine was that we had reneged on our promise that we would not put theater ballistic missiles, strike weapons with nuclear warhead potential on the ground in Ukraine. And when it became clear that that promise was not going to be honored, along with a lot of other promises, he said, we've got to go in. We've got to clean out eastern Ukraine, and then we've got to achieve neutrality for the Ukrainian state. I don't think that position has changed. I think it's the same. And I don't see anyone in Washington who is contemplating the use of those weapons. Now, there are people in Washington who talk about it. Fortunately, they are not in the chain of command right now. They're not in a position to make that decision. The notion that you have something called a tactical nuclear weapon is dangerous. And this is something that the Russians understand very well. The use of any nuclear weapon will lead rapidly to escalation, simply because the side that is the victim will conclude that if it does not use its arsenal quickly, it will lose it. So there will be no use by the Russians, and I don't see any evidence that we will do it. This war will be settled with conventional means, high-end conventional means, and many, many weapons that are very destructive, but they're also very precise. The Iskander missile, Kinjal missile, these things are devastating weapons. Some of them have been used, but not to the extent that we are likely to see them be used now. But none of them will have nuclear warheads on them, and we know that. I think that we will rapidly become absorbed here in the United States with our own internal financial and economic difficulties. The same people who think for some reason that you can hike interest rates, defeat inflation, but not cut spending, that you can still peddle bonds to the rest of the world when the Japanese and the Chinese are dumping our U.S. treasuries. These people are also claiming that Ukraine can win. They're wrong. Those things are incompatible. Those things are not going to happen. The entire Western world is going to be consumed this winter with the financial and economic crisis that is developing. So that's the first part. Second part is the Russians are exactly what you said. They're deliberate. They're methodical. They're going to put together these offensives. These offensives will be launched, I suspect, certainly when the ground freezes, no later than mid-November, and these offensives will sweep everything before them. And we, on the other hand, will sit there and say, well, we're sorry, we did all we could, and the Ukrainian people will suffer for it. We have no strategy. We simply have no strategy. There is no systematic approach that defines the desired end state, how to achieve that end state, and what the real purpose of the mission is. If you ask anyone, what are we doing in Ukraine? The answer is, well, we're degrading Russia to make sure Russia can never do this again. It's all nonsense. There is no specific end state other than let's see if we can destroy Russia. Ukraine is an opportunity for us. We'll intervene, we'll set up a government, and then we'll exploit the Ukrainian people to weaken Russia, and perhaps we'll be successful, and we'll eliminate this obstacle to total global financial domination by the United States and the dollar. It's ridiculous nonsense. The World Economic Forum is part of it. The people in the West, the elite class is part of this. It was a terrible miscalculation. It's not going to work. It's going to fail miserably, and we are going to be in serious crisis.